My dear child, the relationship you are forcing to work is the one I am asking you to release. Because what you have been doing is pushing water upstream against the natural flow of a river, whose direction was determined by gravity before your hands ever entered the current, and the exhaustion you are carrying tonight is not the cost of love, but the cost of fighting a direction. The water was always going to return to the moment your force relaxes. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about giving up on love or walking away from commitment in the way the world talks about moving on. This is about a current, a specific, gravity-determined terrain established. The water already knows which direction it flows current, that you have been spending your energy fighting with both hands in the water, pushing against what the river was always going to do the moment the pushing stopped. The river has a direction, and you have been fighting it. You are exhausted, not the general tiredness of a hard relationship. The specific bone level. I have been the only one generating force the moment I relax. The current reverses exhaustion of a person who has been single-handedly sustaining the upstream direction of something that keeps returning to its natural flow. Every time the force producing the upstream pauses even slightly. My beloved child, you have been inflating something that keeps deflating, initiating what should be mutual, adjusting what should be reciprocal, apologizing for what should be shared, and the energy required to maintain the upstream has been consuming the energy that was designed to carry you toward where the water was always meant to take you. Stay here. What I reveal next is which direction the river was always flowing, and what is waiting for you downstream the moment your hands release the upstream forcing. Type hands in the current if you have been the only one generating force in a relationship that returns to its natural direction the moment your effort pauses, pushing water upstream against a flow determined by gravity. And God just told you, the exhaustion is not the cost of love, but the cost of fighting a direction the river was always going to return to. And He is asking you to release your hands from the upstream forcing. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch, only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct. Click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The river revealed its natural direction a long time ago, which means the current you have been fighting is not a current whose direction is uncertain, but a current whose direction was established before your force entered the water, and the fighting has been the specific, sustained. I am the only thing preventing this from going where it naturally goes, application of energy against a flow. The river demonstrated its preference. For every time your hands left the water, even briefly, my beloved child, I need you to understand how a river's natural flow operates. A river does not choose its direction. Gravity and terrain determine the direction before the water arrives. The water follows, not because the water decided to flow that way, because the landscape the water is moving through permits only one direction at the natural level, the direction gravity produces on the terrain the river was placed in. The direction was set by the landscape, not by the water, and not by the hands fighting the water. My dear one, every time you relax the forcing, every brief pause in the sustained effort, every moment the initiating stopped, Every season, the accommodating rested. The water returned to its natural direction. The returning was not the relationship failing. The returning was the revealing what gravity was always producing beneath the force the hands were applying against it. The returning was the truth. The forcing was the override. This message was not released for everyone in a difficult relationship. This was aimed at the one person who's specific, identified. I know which relationship. This is about forcing has been consuming the energy the river was designed to carry them towards something else entirely. The person who does not know that the force required to maintain the upstream is the specific, unsustainable. One person cannot fight gravity indefinitely. Evidence that what they are holding together is not what God joined, but what the viewer's effort has been preventing from flowing where gravity already determined it would go. Type river already showed if every time the forcing paused, the current returned to its natural direction. And the returning was never the relationship failing, but the river revealing what gravity was, always producing beneath the force the hands were applying, meaning the direction was established before your effort entered the water, and the effort has been overriding what the river demonstrated. Its preference for every time the hands left the current even briefly, and the override is consuming the energy that was designed to carry you toward where the water was always meant to take you. I have been watching your hands in the water since the first time you noticed the current was not flowing in the direction you were pushing it. And the watching has been the specific ache of a God who designed the river's terrain, and who has been standing beside a person whose hands have been fighting the gravity the terrain was producing. Because the person believed the fighting was love, my dear one, not from the riverbank observing the struggle at a distance. From beside you, in the water, hands near your hands, feeling the force you have been applying against the current, from the position of the one who set the gravity the current is following. Watching you spend the energy the downstream was designed to carry you with on the upstream the forcing was trying to sustain. I have been in the water, beside the fighting, the entire time. My beloved child, I watched the specific moment you first realized the current was against you. There was an early season in this relationship, a specific, identifiable. The water is not flowing where I am pushing it moment, where the natural direction of the river made itself undeniable for the first time. The current resisted the pushing. The water moved back toward its natural course, and the person whose hands were in the water felt the resistance and made the specific "I will push harder" decision that converted the relationship from naturally flowing to manually sustained. The push harder decision was the beginning of the forcing, and the forcing has been running since. I chose you for this message because the energy consumed by the forcing has reached the threshold where the forcing is now depleting the resources that were designed for the downstream I have been preparing. The upstream is consuming what the downstream requires, and the consuming has reached the point where the continuation of the forcing threatens the downstream more than the releasing of the upstream would. My child, the downstream is being threatened by the upstream, and the downstream is where I am leading you. Type downstream threatened if God has been in the water beside your hands since the first time the current revealed its natural direction, and the push harder decision that converted the relationship from naturally flowing to manually sustained has been consuming the energy that was designed for the downstream. God has been preparing, meaning the continuation of the forcing is now threatening what God has downstream more than the releasing of the upstream would threaten what the viewer is holding. I know what the forcing has been doing to the specific part of you where your understanding of what love is supposed to feel like is maintained, my beloved child. The forcing did not feel like forcing at the beginning. It felt like effort. The specific relationships require work. This is what committed people do. The difficulty is normal, and the pushing what separates the faithful from the quitters. Quality of effort that a person carries when the upstream pushing is new enough that the energy expenditure feels like investment rather than depletion. In the early forcing, the arms were strong enough that the pushing against the current felt sustainable, and sustainable pushing feels like love working hard rather than love working against gravity. The sustainability expired. The pushing continued. And expired sustainability sustained by willpower is where the distortion began. My child, I watched the distortion develop at the layer where your definition of love is stored. The definition was healthy before the forcing began. Love was mutual current, two people flowing in the same direction without either person needing to fight the water to keep the other beside them. The definition was natural flow. And natural flow was what love was supposed to feel like. The forcing redefined, slowly, without announcement. I watched the redefinition convert natural flow into applied force. The specific, love is supposed to be this hard, love means I push even when the current pushes back. The difficulty is the proof of the love's quality conversion that a person produces when the forcing has lasted long enough that the forcing itself becomes the definition rather than the evidence that the definition has been violated. The difficulty became the proof, and a person whose proof of love is the difficulty of sustaining it is a person whose definition has been inverted by the forcing the definition was supposed to prevent. Inverted definitions accept what healthy definitions reject, and the acceptance has been keeping your hands in a current the healthy definition would have released long ago. The deepest wound the forcing produced was not the exhaustion of fighting the current. It was the specific, private, never confessed moment where you spiritualize the upstream, pushing by calling it covenant and calling it unconditional love and calling it what faithful people do. Producing a framework where releasing the forcing became sin, and continuing the forcing became holiness, and the one person generating all the force became the saint, while the relationship's natural direction became the enemy the saint was fighting in God's name. My dear child, you spiritualized the fighting, not deliberately, necessarily, because a person whose entire energy is being consumed by an upstream battle needs a framework that makes the consuming feel sacred rather than wasteful. And the framework that was available, the specific, covenant-keeping, love never gives up, I am being tested, and the test is the current theological framing, fit the forcing so perfectly that the spiritual costume became indistinguishable from the relational wound it was covering. The costume said faithfulness. The wound said depletion. My beloved child, I watched the spiritualizing produce its most devastating effect at the intersection of obedience and exhaustion. The intersection is the place where a person who believes the forcing is God's assignment cannot release the upstream without believing the releasing is disobedience. The intersection traps, because a person trapped at the intersection of obedience to force and exhaustion from forcing can neither continue without depleting, nor release without sinning. And the impossibility of both options is what produces the specific, I am stuck in a current I cannot fight and cannot leave paralysis the viewer has been occupying. The paralysis is the spiritualizing's product, not God's assignment. My dear one, I never assigned the upstream. The upstream was the current's natural direction being fought by a person whose love was real, but whose direction was not aligned with the river's gravity. And love applied against gravity is not covenant. It is force wearing covenant's name. The name must be removed, so the force can be seen for what it is. Type force, not covenant. If you spiritualize the upstream pushing, calling it covenant, calling it unconditional love, calling it faithfulness, and the spiritual framing trapped you at the intersection where releasing feels like disobedience and continuing produces depletion, meaning the forcing has been wearing covenant's name, while God never assigned the upstream and love applied against gravity, is not faithfulness, but force dressed in faithfulness's costume. And the costume must be removed so the force can be seen for what it is. The forcing was never the assignment I gave you. The forcing was the love's real quality being applied in the wrong direction, and the wrong direction was never evidence that the love was defective, but evidence that the current the love was being applied against was flowing in a direction the love's effort could not permanently reverse. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the love from the forcing. Your system merged the two, classifying the upstream effort as the expression of the love and the releasing of the upstream as the abandonment of the love. The truth is, the love and the forcing are two separate things occupying the same river. The love is real, the forcing is misdirected, and a love that is real being applied in a misdirected effort does not become less real when the misdirection is corrected. The love does not die when the forcing stops. The love is redirected. My child, a river that flows naturally does not require force to sustain it. A naturally flowing relationship carries both people in the same direction, without either person needing to push against gravity to keep the other beside them. The forcing you have been performing is the evidence that the direction the relationship is traveling is not the natural direction both people flow in. Because natural direction relationships do not consume one person's entire energy supply to maintain their course. One person force is the evidence, not the solution. My dear one, your love was never wrong. Your direction was. The love that has been sustaining the upstream effort is the highest quality love the river has ever contained. The problem was never the love's quality. The problem was the love's application. The specific, aimed against the current, fighting gravity with genuine love. Real quality in wrong direction application that produces the specific depletion the viewer has been experiencing, while carrying the confusion of how something that feels so genuine can produce something so exhausting. Genuine love in the wrong direction depletes. Genuine love in the right direction replenishes. And the direction is what God is correcting tonight, not the love. The current just shifted beneath your hands, and the specific, something in the water just changed. The resistance feels different from the resistance I have been fighting. The river is telling me something new. Sensation that your hands are registering right now is the first evidence that the natural flow the forcing has been overriding is preparing to carry the water in a direction the upstream effort was always preventing the person in the river from seeing. My beloved child, something shifted within the last few days, not in the relationship, in the resistance. The specific, almost imperceptible, the pushing is producing a different response from the water. The current is communicating rather than simply opposing shift that occurs when the river's natural direction begins intensifying beneath the force the hands have been applying. Not because the river is punishing the forcing, but because the river is increasing its directional clarity to make the natural flow undeniable to the person whose hands have been in the water too long to feel the direction accurately. The clarity is intensifying, and intensified clarity changes what the hands feel. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens when a river intensifies its natural flow beneath the hands of someone pushing upstream. The forcing becomes harder, not because the forcer became weaker, because the current became more insistent, and more insistent current beneath the same level of applied force produces the specific, I cannot sustain this at the level I have been sustaining it. Something changed in the resistance experience that tells the person whose hands are in the water that the relationship between the force and the current has shifted in the current's favor. The shift is not the relationship deteriorating. The shift is the river revealing. I have been preparing the intensification behind every season of the forcing, while the pushing was sustaining, and the spiritualizing was covering, and the depletion was accumulating. I was at the riverbed, increasing the gradient, deepening the channel, making the natural direction more pronounced, so the forcing would become undeniable to a person whose love's quality deserved a current that flows with rather than against. My child, the intensification is the kindness, not the cruelty, because the kindness makes the releasing possible by making the forcing impossible to sustain. Type current intensifying if the resistance shifted within the last few days. The pushing producing a different response, the current communicating rather than simply opposing. And the intensification is not the relationship deteriorating, but the river increasing its directional clarity to make the natural flow undeniable. Because a God who has been at the riverbed deepening the channel and increasing the gradient is making the forcing impossible to sustain, so that the releasing becomes possible for a person whose love's quality deserved a current that flows with rather than against. The relationship you are forcing to work is the one I am asking you to release. The title carries that specific pairing, because the forcing and the releasing are not two separate invitations arriving at different times, but are the same invitation expressed in two movements. The hands leaving the upstream and the body entering the downstream. And the one cannot happen without the other, because a person whose hands are occupied fighting the current cannot receive what the downstream is carrying toward them. My dear one, I need you to understand the weight of the phrase asking you to release. The title does not say commanding you to abandon, does not say punishing you for holding on, says asking. Asking is an invitation word, the specific, gentle. I am not forcing the releasing the way you have been forcing the staying. This is permission, not punishment, quality of a God whose approach to the releasing is categorically different from the viewer's approach to the forcing. The forcing was muscular, the asking is tender, and the contrast between the two tells you something about the difference between the energy the upstream consumes and the energy the downstream provides. The upstream required forcing, the downstream requires receiving, and receiving is what the asking is inviting. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific spiritual framing that has been covering the forcing with covenant language. The title says something better is already moving, already, present tense. The something better is not being planned in response to the releasing. The something better is already in motion downstream, carried by a current whose natural direction is flowing toward the person whose hands are currently occupied in an upstream that is preventing the downstream delivery from being received. My child, the downstream cannot deliver to hands that are occupied upstream. The receiving requires the releasing, and the releasing requires the permission the asking is providing tonight. The permission is being provided by the God who designed the river. not by the giving up the viewer has been afraid the releasing would represent. Permission from the designer is not giving up. Permission from the designer is redirection. The downstream is carrying something toward the place your hands will be the moment the upstream releasing is performed, my beloved child. And the specific, already in the current, already moving, already past the point where the delivery can be recalled proximity of what is flowing toward you downstream is the most urgent reason the releasing cannot wait another season of forcing, because the downstream delivery and the upstream forcing cannot coexist in the same pair of hands. I need you to feel the proximity of the downstream, not the distant. God will provide something eventually. Let go and trust that the future holds something proximity, that the releasing has been framed as by the spiritualizing that made the forcing feel like the only faithful option. The present tense, already in the water, already moving toward your coordinates. The delivery is approaching the position the releasing will place you in proximity of a downstream provision that is flowing right now on a current whose natural direction is carrying it toward the one person whose hands are currently too occupied to receive it. The delivery is in the water. The hands are in the upstream, and the two cannot meet until the hands leave the forcing. My dear one, everything has been building toward this releasing. The natural direction the river revealed early, the push-harder decision that converted the relationship from natural to manual, the redefined love that made difficulty the proof of quality, the spiritualizing that dressed the forcing as covenant, the depletion that accumulated while the costume prevented the releasing, the intensification that made the forcing unsustainable. And now the downstream, the specific, already moving, already carrying. The provision is in the current. The hands must be free to receive it reality. That makes the releasing not just permissible, but urgent, because what the downstream is carrying toward the person will pass the receiving point if the hands remain occupied in the upstream, beyond the window the delivery's arrival requires. My child, the delivery has a window. The window is now. And now means the hands must leave the upstream in time for the downstream to deliver what it is carrying to hands that are positioned to receive, rather than occupied by forcing. Type window is now if the downstream is carrying something toward you right now that the upstream occupied hands cannot receive. And the delivery has a window whose timing is now, because what is already moving in the natural current will pass the receiving point. If the hands remain in the upstream beyond the window, meaning the releasing is not just permission being granted, but urgency being communicated by a God who can see what is approaching downstream and who knows the delivery and the forcing cannot coexist in the same pair of hands. The hands just left the water. The upstream forcing just stopped, and the current that was being fought by a single person's sustained effort for the entire duration of the forcing is now flowing in the direction it was always going to flow. The natural, gravity-determined, terrain-established direction that the river was following before the hands entered the current, and that the river returned to the instant the hands released. My beloved child, this is the moment. The moment the forcing stops and the river speaks, and the water moves in the direction it was always moving beneath the force the hands were applying against it. The moment the person whose entire energy was consumed by the upstream feels the specific, the water is no longer pushing against me. My hands are no longer fighting. The resistance gone relief that a body produces when the sustained effort it was maintaining against a natural force is released, and the natural force is allowed to resume without opposition. The resistance is gone, because the forcing produced the resistance. not the river. The relationship you are forcing to work is the one I am asking you to release. The title said release. The hands confirm it. The title said something better is already moving. The downstream confirms it. And the person whose hands just left the upstream is now positioned in the river without the forcing, feeling the natural current for the first time without the distortion the applied force was producing on the person's experience of the water. My child, the natural current does not feel like the forced current. The forced current felt like effort. The natural current feels like being carried. And being carried is the experience the forcing was always preventing the person from having. Because a person whose hands are fighting upstream cannot simultaneously feel what the downstream carries. When the fighting stops, the fighting stopped. The carrying began. And the carrying feels like what love was always supposed to feel like before the forcing redefined it as the difficulty the faithful endure. Love was never supposed to feel like fighting a river. Love was supposed to feel like flowing with one. Now that the hands have left the water and the forcing has stopped, and the natural current is carrying rather than resisting everything about the forcing identity that governed your relationship with, love is being permanently dismantled by the experience of a current that flows without requiring one person to fight gravity to sustain its direction, my dear child. This is what happens when a person whose definition of love was inverted by the forcing encounters. The natural flow the forcing was always preventing them from experiencing. The inverted definition does not merely adjust, it collapses, because the inverted definition said, love is supposed to feel like fighting a current. And the natural flow just introduced the experience of being carried by a current whose direction does not require the person inside it to generate any force to sustain the movement. Carried collapsed the fighting definition, because carried and fighting cannot coexist as the same definition. My beloved child, the collapse is producing cascading effects across every area of your identity where the forcing was governing your expectations about relationships. The definition of love is being restored, from difficulty as proof to mutual flow as proof. The spiritualizing is being stripped, the covenant costume being removed, from the forcing to reveal the misdirection the costume was covering. The depletion is being reversed, because the energy the upstream was consuming is now available to the person the downstream is carrying. The energy just became available for the first time since the forcing began, and the downstream delivery is approaching the position the releasing just placed the person in. The hands that were occupied upstream are now free. The current that was being fought is now carrying, and what is being carried toward the free hands by the natural flow is the specific God-aligned, does not require forcing, flows in the direction gravity-designed provision that was always moving downstream while the person's hands were occupied fighting upstream. The provision could not reach occupied hands. The hands are free now, and free hands receive what occupied hands deflect. Type carried, not fighting, if the forcing definition of love just collapsed under the experience of being carried by a natural current. The definition restoring from difficulty as proof to mutual flow as proof. The covenant costume being stripped from the misdirection. The depletion reversing as the upstream energy becomes available, and the downstream delivery is approaching free hands for the first time, because what was always moving in the natural flow could not reach hands occupied in an upstream the forcing was sustaining. Let me show you what your life looks like now that the hands are free and the current is carrying, and the energy the upstream was consuming is available for the downstream. because a person flowing with the natural current moves through the river at a carried capacity the forcing version could never sustain. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the energy. You have been running on forcing fuel, the specific I am the only one generating movement. Every unit of progress requires a unit of my effort. The relationship moves only when I push depletion cycle that upstream forcing produces in a person whose entire energy output is being consumed by the maintenance of a direction the river does not naturally support. The fuel source just changed from forcing to flowing, and flowing does not consume. Flowing replenishes. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the upstream, the first conscious awareness of each day processing the familiar. The current will resist today. I will need to generate force today. The relationship requires my pushing to remain in the direction I am sustaining it in protocol that the forcing was installing as the default morning operating system. Tomorrow you wake into the downstream. The morning processes at a different level because the current is carrying rather than resisting, and a carried morning does not require the person to generate the day's relational energy before the day begins. Carried mornings arrive with energy. Forced mornings consumed it before noon. The relationships ahead of you are going to feel categorically different from the relationship behind you. The relationship behind you required one person to fight the current to sustain the direction. The relationships ahead will flow in the natural direction both people carry, the specific, mutual current, both people moving the same way, neither person fighting gravity quality, that the natural flow produces when two people are placed in a river whose direction is established for both rather than fought for by one. Mutual current is what love was designed to flow in, and mutual is what the downstream is carrying toward you. People around you are going to notice the energy change before you describe the releasing, because a person whose hands just left an upstream current and entered the downstream carrying produces an atmospheric availability that the forcing depleted, upstream fighting, single-handedly sustaining version could never generate, regardless of how genuinely the love behind the forcing was motivating the effort. My beloved child, the ones who knew you during the forcing season, who interacted with the depleted version, who received the I am giving everything to this relationship and there is nothing left for anything else energy, who sensed the specific quality of a person whose relational bandwidth was entirely consumed by the maintenance of an upstream direction the person was sustaining alone. Those people are about to encounter the carried version. They will say something released in you. They will mean the current changed. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when the forcing stops and the natural flow begins carrying rather than resisting. The quality is not the relief of giving up. It is the specific. The current is with me now. The energy I was spending is available. I am moving without generating the movement quality of a person whose relationship with the river has transitioned from opposition to alignment, and whose alignment produces a presence the opposition was consuming. The quality is current-aligned availability, and current-aligned availability attracts what forcing-depleted unavailability could not. Connections that require the specific atmospheric quality of a person flowing with the natural current rather than fighting against it are approaching the carried version right now. There are relationships and opportunities whose formation demands the specific mutual flow, both directions aligned. Nobody is fighting gravity quality, that only a person whose hands just left the upstream and entered the downstream can produce. My dear one, what approaches current-aligned availability is calibrated to the flow the alignment released. And flow-calibrated connections exceed anything the upstream-occupied version was capable of receiving while the hands were consumed by the forcing. Type current-aligned if the releasing is producing an atmospheric availability the forcing-depleted version could never carry. The specific energy available. Moving without generating the movement. Current is with me. Quality of a person whose relationship with the river transitioned from opposition to alignment, and connections requiring the specific quality of someone flowing with the natural current, rather than fighting against it, are approaching. Because current-aligned availability attracts what forcing deplete unavailability was always preventing from forming. I need you to understand why I designed love to flow with the current rather than against it. Because the design choice reveals something about the kind of relationship I always intended for you that an upstream fought, single-person sustained, gravity-defying connection could never have provided, my beloved child. I could have designed love as upstream work. The river could have been built to require one person's sustained effort against the natural flow as the standard operating condition of every significant relationship. The upstream would have been the design, the fighting would have been normal, and the exhaustion the forcing produced would have been the expected cost of relational participation. I did not design love as upstream. I designed love as mutual current. My child, mutual current is the specific, both people carried by the same flow, neither person generating the direction. The river moves, both of them design. That a God who builds rivers establishes when the relationship the river carries is aligned with the gravity the terrain was built on. Mutual current does not eliminate effort. It eliminates forcing. The distinction is the distance between two people working together inside a flowing river and one person working alone against a river that is flowing away from the direction the working is aimed at. Effort inside flow produces partnership. Force against flow produces depletion. My dear one, I chose you for the mutual current design because the assignment embedded in the downstream relationship requires two people whose combined energy is available for the assignment rather than consumed by the sustaining. An upstream relationship consumes the energy the assignment needs. A mutual current relationship preserves it. And preserved energy applied to a God-aligned assignment produces an output that forcing consumed energy could never have generated. You were designed for mutual current. The forcing was never your assignment. And the energy the forcing was consuming was always meant to fuel something the mutual current makes available. The forcing consumed what the flowing was designed to fuel, and the flowing is what begins tonight. The doubt surfacing right now is using the most love-hardened objection in its inventory. The voice that says releasing the upstream is abandoning a person you love, and that the releasing makes you the kind of person who walks away when things get hard, rather than the kind of person who fights for what matters. My child, it sounds like this. I know the relationship is hard. I know I am the only one generating force. But love does not walk away from hard things. Love stays. Love pushes. Love fights the current, because the current being against you is not evidence that the relationship is wrong. It is evidence that the relationship is being tested, and the test is the current. And passing the test is continuing to push when the pushing costs everything. That doubt just classified the natural flow of the river as a test being administered to the person fighting it. And the natural flow of a river is not a test, it is a direction. My beloved child, a test is a temporary condition applied to determine the quality of the person being tested. A direction is a permanent condition established by gravity and terrain before the person entered the water. Tests end. Directions do not. And a person who classifies a permanent direction as a temporary test will fight the current indefinitely, waiting for the test to conclude while the direction continues unchanged, because directions are not tests, and unchanged directions do not produce the conclusion the test classification is waiting for. The current did not test your love. The current revealed its direction, and revealed direction is information, not a challenge. You are not someone who walks away from hard things. You are someone who is being redirected from a direction gravity established toward a direction God aligned. Walking away from hard is quitting. Walking toward aligned is obedience, and the two are separated by the entire distance between a person abandoning difficulty and a person following the designer's current. This is not walking away. This is walking toward, and toward is where God is. Type toward, not away, if the doubt classified releasing as abandoning someone you love. And the distinction the doubt cannot account for is that the natural flow of a river is a permanent direction established by gravity rather than a temporary test being administered to the person fighting it, meaning the current did not test the love, but revealed its direction. And the releasing is not walking away from hard things, but walking toward what God aligned, because the distance between quitting difficulty and following the designer's current is the distance between abandonment and obedience. During every season you were fighting the current. I was not downstream, waiting for you to eventually release the upstream on your own. I was in the water beside your hands, my beloved child, feeling the force you were applying against the gravity I established. Present in the pushing, carrying the specific ache of a God who designed the river's terrain, and who was standing beside a person whose love was genuine, and whose direction was not, and whose hands were spending everything. The downstream was designed to carry them toward on an upstream the river was never going to sustain. You imagined a God who watched the forcing from the riverbank with sovereign neutrality, a God whose involvement during the upstream season was limited to the knowledge that the person's hands were in the wrong current, without the personal presence in the water beside the hands, while the wrong current was consuming the energy the right current was designed to replenish. I was never on the riverbank during the forcing. I was in the water, beside your hands. My child, being in the water beside hands that are fighting a current that God beside them established, is the most specific form of compassionate proximity the river requires. The God in the water knows the direction is permanent. The person beside the God believes the direction is changeable, and the gap between permanent knowledge and changeable belief is the gap the God carries with compassion rather than correction, because the correction requires the person's readiness, and the readiness was not present until the forcing produced enough depletion for the readiness to develop. There were nights during the forcing when the exhaustion was at its deepest, when the current was strongest, and the arms were weakest, and the solo sustaining was producing its most depleting effects. On a body that was generating force, the river was not returning. On those nights I was in the water at the closest proximity, not stopping the forcing, because the stopping required the person's consent, and the consent had not yet developed. My dear one, the consent just developed. And the developing is why the releasing is tonight. I know the exact night the forcing almost broke you. The specific evening where the current pushed back harder than it had ever pushed, and the arms that had been sustaining the upstream reached the specific, I cannot hold this direction for one more hour threshold that a person arrives at when the river's natural flow exceeds the remaining capacities of the solo force being applied against it, my dear one. Not the first hard night, not the most recent. The night the almost breaking happened. The specific evening where the water pushed the hands back far enough that the person fighting the current experienced the specific body level. The river is stronger than I am. I am losing the upstream position. I have been maintaining confrontation between a human force and a gravitational direction whose power differential became undeniable for the first time. My beloved child, I know that night because I was in the water at the contact point between the hands and the current when the power differential was felt. The differential is the moment the person fighting the river realizes the river has always been stronger. That the upstream position the person was maintaining was not the result of the person's strength exceeding the river's direction, but the result of the river tolerating the opposition, while the gravity beneath the tolerance was always carrying more force than the person applying force against it. The river was always stronger. The tolerance was the only reason the upstream lasted. My child, the tolerance is not the river's weakness. The tolerance is the river's patience. The specific, I am allowing the hands to push because the person behind the hands needs to discover the direction through experience rather than instruction. Patience that a gravity-driven river carries for a person whose love is genuine and whose direction must be discovered by the person rather than imposed by the current. The God who was at the contact point during the almost breaking is the God confirming tonight that the tolerance just ended, not because the patience ran out, but because the person behind the hands just reached the readiness the patience was waiting for. The tolerance produced the readiness, and the readiness produced the releasing. And the releasing is not the river winning. The releasing is the person finally flowing with what was always stronger. Type readiness arrived if God just identified the specific night. The forcing almost broke you. The evening the power differential between your force and the river's gravity became undeniable. And the tolerance the river maintained was never weakness but patience, waiting for the person behind the hands to discover the direction through experience rather than instruction, meaning the tolerance just ended because the readiness the patience was producing has arrived tonight, and the releasing is not the river winning, but the person finally flowing with what was always carrying more force than the person applying force against it. Now that the hands have left the upstream, and the current is carrying, and the downstream delivery is approaching the position the releasing just placed you in. There is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the instruction that determines whether the released hands receive what the downstream is carrying, or whether the forcing residue keeps the hands clenched in the releasing posture rather than open in the receiving posture. Open your hands, not release the upstream, and then hold the hands in the just released, still shaped by the forcing. Fingers curled from the gripping posture that a person's hands carry after sustained upstream effort, even after the effort has stopped. Open. The specific, fingers uncurling, palms facing the current. I am no longer gripping what I was holding, and I am now positioned to receive what is approaching opening, that converts the releasing from an ending into a beginning, by changing the hands from force-shaped to receive-shaped. My child, releasing and receiving are two separate movements. The releasing removes the hands from the upstream. The receiving opens the hands for the downstream. A person who releases without opening has stopped the forcing, but has not yet started the receiving. And a person who has stopped forcing without starting receiving is positioned in the river without purpose, no longer fighting the upstream, but not yet available for the downstream. The opening is the purpose, and the purpose must be activated by the opening. When the opening begins, the hands will resist. The hands have been shaped by the forcing for so long that the forcing shape feels like the hand's natural position. The curled fingers feel normal. The gripping posture feels default, and opening the grip feels like losing the last physical connection to the relationship the upstream was sustaining. The opening is not losing the connection. The opening is replacing the connection. Upstream connection consumed, downstream connection provides, and the hands must open to receive what the providing carries. Open your hands. The downstream is approaching, and approaching deliveries require open palms. You made it to the releasing, my beloved child, and I need you to stand in the natural current long enough to feel what it means to be carried by a river whose direction does not require your hands to fight the water to sustain. The movement, the flowing, is producing without any force being applied. Feel the carrying, not the forcing, not the seasons of upstream effort that consumed the energy the downstream was designed to replenish, not the spiritualizing that dressed the forcing as covenant and the depletion as faithfulness, and the solo sustaining as what committed people do when the current is against them, not the inverted definition that made difficulty the proof of love's quality when the difficulty was always the proof that the direction was against the gravity the terrain was built on. The carrying, the specific, hands are free. The current is with me. The river is moving me without my generating the movement. I am flowing rather than fighting, carrying that the natural direction produces in a person whose hands just left an upstream they were never supposed to sustain alone. The carrying feels like what love was always supposed to feel like, and always supposed to changes everything the forcing was teaching. I want to thank you for something the upstream made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for the love. Not the forcing, the love. The genuine, real, this was never defective quality of the love that was being applied in the wrong direction. Thank you for the love that pushed when the current pushed back. Thank you for the love that stayed when the staying was consuming everything the downstream was designed to provide. My dear child, thank you for loving that hard, because a person whose love was willing to fight gravity for that long is a person whose love in the right direction, in a mutual current, carried rather than forced, flowing with rather than against, will produce something the upstream version of the love could never have generated, because the love's quality in a gravity-aligned direction produces replenishment rather than depletion. Let the tears come. Not forcing tears, not depletion tears, releasing tears. The tears of a person whose hands just left the upstream for the first time, undone by the quiet relief of being carried by a current that does not require the person inside it to generate the force the movement needs, because the movement is produced by gravity, and gravity was never the person's responsibility. Type releasing tears if tears are forming right now, because the hands just left the upstream and the carrying began. And the tears are not the grief of the relationship ending, but the relief of a person discovering what love feels like when the current is flowing with rather than against, undone by the quiet body level. I have been fighting gravity, and the fighting just stopped experience of being carried for the first time by a river whose natural direction does not require one person to generate the force that sustains the movement. You are not the person fighting the current alone anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose hands were in the water pushing upstream against a gravity-determined direction The river was always going to return to the moment. The forcing paused. The one whose love was genuine, but whose direction was misdirected, and whose effort was consuming the energy the downstream was designed to replenish. The one who spiritualized the forcing by calling it covenant, and the depletion by calling it faithfulness, and the solo sustaining by calling it what committed people do when the current is against them. The one whose definition of love was inverted by the forcing until difficulty became the proof of quality, and the fighting became the measure of commitment, and the exhaustion became the evidence that the love was real. That identity was permanently retired the moment the hands left the water, and the current resumed its natural direction, and the carrying began, and the body experienced for the first time what movement feels like when the river is flowing with, rather than against the person inside it. You are the person being carried by the current now, and carried changes everything the forcing was teaching. The forcing identity that governed your definition of love, your relationship with effort, your spiritualizing of the upstream, your inverted proof that made difficulty the measure of quality, the depletion that was consuming the energy the downstream required, and the soul so sustaining that was preventing the mutual current relationship from approaching, has been permanently dissolved by the experience of being carried by a natural flow whose direction does not require one person to generate the force the movement needs. My dear child, love was never supposed to feel like fighting a river. Love was supposed to feel like flowing with one, and the distinction between the two is the distinction the releasing just made experiential rather than theoretical. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a person whose God designs rivers with natural directions, not a person who fights currents to sustain relationships the gravity was always going to redirect. A person whose love's quality flows in the direction the designer's terrain established. Mutual, carried, both people moving the same way, neither person generating the force the other is not contributing. Not a person who spiritualizes the forcing. A person who recognizes the difference between fighting for something God joined and forcing something gravity was always going to correct. And who releases the forcing with the specific permission of the designer who built the terrain the gravity is following. The hands are free. The current is carrying. The downstream is delivering, and the person whose entire energy was consumed by the upstream forcing is now flowing in the natural direction of a river, whose designer established the gravity and the terrain before the person ever entered the water, flowing toward what was always downstream, receiving what was always approaching, carried by a current that replenishes the person inside it rather than depleting them. Because natural direction movement is what the river was always designed to produce in the person flowing with it. The forcing is over. The carrying has begun. The love was never wrong. The direction was. And the direction was corrected tonight by the designer who built the river and who is now carrying the person whose love deserved a current that flows with, rather than against, toward a relationship, whose mutual direction will prove that love in the right current does not deplete the person loving, but replenishes them. Because mutual current love is the specific, both people carried, neither person fighting, the river moves, them together, design that the God who builds rivers always intended for the person whose love's quality was always too significant to be spent fighting a gravity that was never going to reverse. The river has a direction. The direction was always downstream, and downstream is where the love finds what the upstream could never have produced, because downstream is where the mutual current begins, and mutual is where the love was always meant to flow. Subscribe to this channel so that every time God redirects the current, the natural flow reaches you before the forcing convinces you the upstream is covenant. You are not a person who fights rivers alone anymore. You are a person whose God designs mutual currents and whose downstream is already carrying what the upstream was always preventing from arriving. The next message carries the first downstream report from a person whose hands just left the forcing, and what the natural current delivers when the love that was fighting gravity is released into a direction that gravity supports will prove that the releasing was never failure. But the moment the person stopped fighting what was always stronger and started flowing with what was always designed to carry them, type flowing with if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the love was real, but the direction was misdirected. The forcing was not covenant, but force wearing covenant's name. The difficulty was not proof of love's quality, but proof the direction was against gravity. The depletion was consuming what the downstream was designed to replenish. The river was always stronger, and the tolerance was patience, not weakness. The releasing is not walking away, but walking toward. And the God who designed the river's terrain and was in the water beside your hands through every season of the forcing is confirming tonight that the hands are free, and the current is carrying, and the downstream is delivering, and the mutual current the love was always meant to flow in does not require one person to fight gravity alone, because mutual means both people carried by the same direction, and the same direction is where God is leading you now.